Good. All right. Thank you. Good evening. My name is June Oberdorfer, and I'm a hydrogeologist. So a hydrogeologist is just a geologist who's specialized in underground water. And so what I want to be talking to you about tonight are some of the predicted impacts to groundwater of the reopening of the Idaho-Maryland mine, or the proposed reopening. And, this is certainly, I think, of interest to those of you who have wells in the vicinity of the mine, who might be concerned about whether you're going to have enough water in the future. But I think it's also of interest to the broader community, because I think there's just very broad concern about having sufficient water resources in the future. So I'm going to try and present sort of three topics. One is simply a current view of groundwater conditions in the area of the mine, and then really focus in on some of the predicted impacts. And these are impacts of mine dewatering. In order for them to go down at great depths, thousands of feet underground, they have to pump water out of those mines. Both the existing tunnels and shafts that from the historic mining in the past, but also any tunnels and shafts that are constructed in the course of expanding the mine in the future. So there are predictions, and I think there are a number of shortcomings about those predictions, and I want to touch on those. And finally, I want to give some recommendations for ways that of reducing uncertainties about those predictions. So the first slide here is kind of a spoiler slide. It's the most important thing in this talk. And so if you remember nothing else, sort of remember what this picture is here. And I'm going to refer to this map as the impact map, because this is really what the predictions are about mine dewatering. So let me just walk you through it for a minute. This green dashed line are the outlines of the mineral rights that Rise Gold holds. And to orient you, here's some of the creeks: Wolf Creek to the north, the South Fork of Wolf Creek to the south. There's a ridge that runs more or less east-west along this area. And what these orange contours are, these orange lines, they're contour lines. So here is the 10-foot contour. So anything on that line indicates that the water table is going to drop 10 feet. Within that contour, more than 10 feet. There's another contour here that is 5 feet. So that's how much the water table is going to be lowered, according to their predictions. And the last contour is a 1-foot contour. So 1 foot of lowering of the water table. So you can see that this area within these contours encompasses most of the mineral rights area, and in fact goes outside of the mineral rights areas in certain portions. It's this map that lets Rise Gold say that the impact is not going to be that great from them pumping water out of the mine, and that there's actually a fairly limited area in sort of this region along East Bennett Road, where some of the most of the lowering of the water table occurs, where they're going to have to go in and put supplemental water in, so install pipelines, offer people hookups to that pipeline. So this map is really important, and I guess the big question for me is, how much confidence do we have in the accuracy of this map? So for those of you with wells in the area, you might be really important to you, might be important as well to people who supply water in the surrounding area. important to the county, since they're the ones who are going to approve or not approve the application for the mine. They need to have some confidence in how much impact it will have on citizens within their jurisdiction. And lastly, I think having confidence in this map is also important to RISE, because if it underestimates the impact, then instead of just providing supplemental water along a small area, they might need to expand where they have to put in pipelines and hookups. And so, for all that reason, how confident are we that this map actually predicts the future well? So let me just give you a little bit of the geographic setting. Here's that ridge that I talked about, bordered on the north by Wolf Creek, on the south by the South Fork of Wolf Creek. Here's what I think of Grass Valley, downtown Grass Valley. I actually have friends in the Nevada City, Grass Valley area. That's sort of how I got involved with this. I live in San Jose, but so I'm familiar with some of this area. And it's beautiful. So to understand movement of groundwater, you really need to have some understanding of the underlying geology. And of course, as a geologist, this is important to me. At shallow levels beneath this ridge, the rocks are broken down, they're weathered, and they're moderately permeable, so water can flow through them somewhat easily. As you get deeper down, that weathering or that breaking up of the rock decreases, and the permeability decreases as you go deeper, until you're at a great depths down here, the depths of the mine, the permeability of those rocks is very low. So it's difficult for water to move through. So a groundwater body, almost a mound here beneath this ridge, gets built up as precipitation is added through the ground surface. So precipitation is both rainfall and snowmelt. Some of that rainfall that falls on the surface will evaporate back into the air. Some of it will run across the surface and into the streams. Some of it will get taken up by plants and transpired back into the air. But a fraction of it, or a percentage of it, will actually percolate down and add to that groundwater recharge, add to that groundwater body. So one of the questions is, boy, of that precipitation, which is about on the order of 53 inches a year in Grass Valley, what percent of it actually goes to groundwater recharge? And we'll talk about that a little later. Oops, sorry, I went too far. Let me go back. Oh, no, I didn't. So I did, sorry, I know I was missing a slide. My apologies. Groundwater flow. So water moves through these rocks underground. Most of the flow takes place at shallow depths where the rocks are permeable. Again, as you go deeper down, less and less flow because those rocks are more and more impermeable. So there's inflow from the east, general flow here to the west, down towards Grass Valley, but also some local discharge from the shallow aquifer into the adjacent creeks, providing base flow to those creeks. And then there are man-made outflows. So, one of the outflows are water supply wells. They remove groundwater. So these are installed primarily in these uppermost permeable zones. Wells along the ridge are typically on the order of 100 to 200 feet deep, although there are a few deeper wells also. And so people pump out of these for their water supply in their homes and businesses. There's a second man-made outflow though, which is the old mine workings. So the vertical shafts and the tunnels that are interconnected through many of the old mines. And water can flow down through these and then exit out. It drains here in the low-lying area, sort of close to Centennial Drive and Wolf Creek. And this is actually a much better diagram than mine. This is a figure produced by Itasca Denver, who's a consultant to Rise Gold. And this is the same company that produced the impact map. So that one map that we were looking at earlier. And what this is a cross section or a vertical slice down into the earth along the line of that ridge. So here you can see the ground surface. You can see recharging that groundwater body. Here's the water table. This blue line is the water table. And the other things you can see here are some of the old mines. So the Brunswick mine and a couple of sections of the Idaho mine. And then all the shafts and tunnels that connect those. And I've added red arrows. And so on a number of these slides, you'll see that I've added red annotations. And so, water can flow down through these shafts, laterally through the tunnels, up other shafts, and ultimately sort of exits out here in the topographic, so the lowest portion of the land surface near Wolf Creek. That flow of water out to the creek, there's some discussion about how much there is or uncertainty. One of the consultants, MCO for Rise Gold, estimates it on about the order of 100 gallons per minute, although it certainly can be more during times of heavy rainfall. That flow on the order of about 100 gallons per minute drains some of the water out of that shallow water bearing zone and lowers the water table. And within the mine itself, because these mine tunnels are so permeable, we get a lower water even still. So this water elevation inside the mines itself is about the same elevation as the drains. So even this much pressure can push that water through that mine and out at this discharge point. So these are the sort of two reports that I'm largely drawing from that present Rise's predictions about, boy, how much impact on that shallow aquifer is dewatering. So pumping, large volumes of water out of the groundwater, how much is that going to have? The first of these is the groundwater hydrology report, and it's a large report that deals with a lot of different water aspects of reopening the mine. And the consultant that prepared it is MCO Environmental. And so they were the ones that gave that estimate of the flow to the drains there. They also discuss the impacts of mining, but they rely really heavily for that discussion on a second report, which is a computer modeling report. And this report's done by this consulting company I mentioned. I showed figures of Itasca Denver. And Itasca, in its turn, has come back and used a number of the input values from MCO to put into their computer model or computer simulation. So here we have another Itasca figure, and this is a conceptual model. So what they think is going on when the mine is expanded. So this darker brown area here is the region of the expanded mine. And for miners to be able to come down and access this, They have to pump water out, and it's going to be pumped out of the New Brunswick shaft. And that's going to change that flow. It's going to bring flow down into this area that's being pumped out of. It's actually going to reverse flow here, bring water back this direction. And it's going to, in the process of doing it, lower this water table. And in fact, it's going to lower it so much that the flow to the drains here is going to stop. And so, you know, if I were a well owner and I lived over this area and my well were coming into this aquifer, I'd really want to have a good idea of how much that water level was going to be lowered, because it might reduce how much I could pump out, or it might even cause my well to go dry. So computer models are fairly complex things, and an important step in modeling is what's called the model calibration. And you can think of this as sort of fine-tuning the model, adjusting things. And what you're trying to adjust is the model in order to reproduce historic data. And if it can reproduce that historic data, it gives you a better feeling that when you then use it to predict in the future, it's going to be able to predict accurately. And mostly what Itasca fine-tuned or calibrated, adjusted, were the permeabilities of the rocks. And the time period, historic time period they calibrated to was from 1919 to 1956, the more recent period of mining. And they did a reasonably good job of calibrating that model to historic dewatering pumping rates. So how much the former mining companies were pumping out of the ground, which was on the order of about 700 gallons per minute. On the other hand, they weren't able to calibrate the model to shallow groundwater data, because those well data from that historic period are, you know, extremely difficult, if not impossible to find, if they exist. And the trouble with this, when you're trying to make predictions about shallow groundwater response, not having it calibrated to historic groundwater levels really puts a lot of uncertainty into the accuracy of any predictions you make. The other thing they calibrated to do were current water level conditions, and these were groundwater levels, again, in shallow wells. These were obtained by a couple of consultants sort of intermittently between 1994 and 2007. Again, Itasca did a reasonably good job of calibrating the water levels, so shallow water levels, to this historic data. One sort of thing that was interesting about these historic data were that although there were fluctuations between summer and winter, lower in summer, higher in winter, on a sort of year-to-year comparison basis, the water levels were pretty stable. And so that says that this groundwater system is in equilibrium. What's coming in is equal to what's going out. And they also looked at effects of flow to the drains. And we'll look at that in just a minute. So again, sort of looking at current conditions, what are the impacts of flow that's going out through those drains? So these are some of the results of that historic calibration. So this is what's called a hydrograph. So it's looking at water levels as they change over time. On this horizontal axis, we have time from 1920 up to 2020, so 100 years. On the vertical axis, we have the elevation of the water And this is as shown by this green line. Whoops. This green line here. And what we're looking at in this plot is the water level within the New Brunswick mine. And you can see as various mines come online, the water level within the New Brunswick mine drops, but drops very significantly when the New Brunswick and the New Idaho mines are connected, and then stabilizes at sort of the bottom of the mined area, which is at about 1,200 feet above mean sea level. So when these mine water levels inside the mine were at the lowest, that's also when the water levels in the overlying aquifer would have been at their lowest. When pumping was shut off, water levels in the mine would have recovered, and water levels also in that overlying aquifer here would have come back up also. And the water levels within the mine itself stabilized at this elevation of about 2,500 feet. And these blue squares you can see here are actually historic measured values. And they stabilize at about this elevation because that's about the elevation of the drain. And it really is restricting that outflow at the drain, restricts the mine water levels from recovering to pre-mining levels. One thing, if I were doing this and I wanted to make predictions starting off into the future, so from present day off into the future, I would have taken these present day recovered water levels, both in the mine, but also here in the shallow aquifer, as my starting point for trying to simulate or make predictions about the future. And one concern that I have with what Itasca did is they actually took this time point. So there's low water levels in the mine and lower water levels in the shallow aquifer as their starting point for predicting what would take place in the future. And that concerns me because, boy, if you start out with lower water levels, that's really going to bias what the outcome will be of your future predictions. Oops. So this is a different hydrograph. Again, the same time axis down here, those same 100 years. Again, elevations on the vertical scale. And again, we have a hydrograph, but now we're looking at the elevations in the Union Hill mine. And you can see that Union Hill mine is not connected. It sits immediately adjacent to the New Brunswick mine, but it's not connected to it with tunnels or shafts. So it's much more isolated. It's only connected to that area through small openings in the rock. But it's connected enough that when they started pumping a great deal out of the New Brunswick mine, water levels within that Union Hill mine started to drop. And this is the one historic water level that they had to calibrate to, which is water level measured at the end of mining in 1956, not mining in the Union Hill, but mining in the adjacent New Brunswick mine. And that's about 20 feet lower than the sort of current day recovered water level. And so this 20 feet lowering, historic lowering of the water table is important. And I want you to remember that because it's going to come back later in the discussion. In order to calibrate to this historic water level, Itasca in its modeling had to put a really low permeability layer around the Union Hill mine to really isolate it well. Otherwise, they would have had much greater drawdowns than 20 feet. And what that tells me is outside of the Union Hill mine and the adjacent New Brunswick mine area, they must have had water levels that were significantly lower than this 20 feet observed, 20 feet drawdown observed. So after again, the mine was, the New Brunswick mine was shut off, and you had gradual recovery here in the Union Hill mine. And so that the current water level in that Union Hill mine is actually about 165 feet up above the New Brunswick mine, just sort of reinforcing the idea it's really separated hydrologically from the adjacent mines. So I've sort of taken you up to the present day, and I want to make a comment now about some of what I consider shortcomings in Itasca's report, is that they didn't present what the response of the shallow aquifer was to historic mine dewatering. So there were no contour maps of drawdown in 1956. There weren't hydrographs that presented how water levels in the shallow aquifer would have dropped and would have recovered. And I think this is a real shortcoming, because that calibrated historic simulation would give us some idea of what would take place in the future if the mine were to reopen and expand. Okay, this is sort of the last of the simulations that I want to talk about up to the present day. And this is looking, again, you're going to recognize the mineral rights boundary again in the creeks. This is what Itasca's modeled are the consequences of water flowing out to the drain, sort of out in this area. So, on the order of about 100 gallons per minute flow out through that area would create about, again, 10 feet of drawdown here, 5 feet, and then the 1 foot contour of how much the water table would be lowered. And what, I think of this, boy, if there's this much drawdown when 100 gallons per minute is taken out of that mine area, it would be really, really useful to know at the end of the historic period in 1956, when they were pumping about 700 gallons per minute, you'd expect on the order of about 700 or 7 times as much drawdown to appear. And that's, would be really good to know what a map of those contours would say. Okay, we're moving now on into the future. So this is now looking at predictions starting sort of from present day. And this is if the mine were to reopen. So Itasca has simulated that mine as sort of opening up in sections. First 5 years of mine expansion is shown in purple here, the next 5 years in blue, 5 years after that in orange, and then the last 10 years up to a total now of 25 years is shown in green here. And some of the additional tunnels and shafts that would go with that. So this is what the model predicts how much water would have to be pumped out of the mine to keep it dewatered over that 25 proposed years of mine expansion. So you can see it sort of jumps up quickly to about 800. Every time they open a new area of mine, the pumping rate goes up temporarily and goes back down, but ultimately stabilizes at about 900 on average, 900 gallons per minute that they'll be pumping out. So now we're back to the impact map, that spoiler map that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. And again, boy, we see that same sort of magnitude, 10 feet of drawdown in this area, that expanded 1 foot contour. The thing is, if you think back to what the drawdown looked like when there was only the flow to the drain, about 100 gallons per minute, we have 9 times as much pumping now as is coming out at the drains. You'd expect to see about 9 times as much drawdown. And I'm not seeing that in this diagram. The other thing that concerns me is that historic 20-foot drawdown that was observed in the Union Hill Mine. And the Union Hill Mine sits right about here. And, certainly greater pumping now. And I would expect to see more than 20 feet of drawdown in this area, but there's only 5 feet or less of drawdown. And so, I think they haven't even matched historic data. And that sort of brings me back to the concern about where they started simulating from 1956 instead of present day. They also go on, Itasca does, to simulate, well, let's suppose the mining doesn't stop after 25 years, that it actually goes an additional 40 years. So again, you're used to the map here with the mineral rights boundary. The green colored areas are areas that would have been mined in the first 25 years. And then the blue areas are areas that hypothetically would be mined over the next 40 years for a total of 65 years of mine expansion. So here you see it in map view, here in cross section. So this is the region expanded into in the first 25 years. And then the blue regions are the expansion after for the following 40 years. And so there's a greater region both in lateral extent and in vertical extent. And you'd expect both a lot more pumping, and you'd also expect a lot more impact over a greater area, an expanded area. And we do see that greater pumping. So here's in orange is their, what they call their base case, the first 25 years that we looked at earlier, sort of stabilizing at around 900 gallons per minute. But as the mines expanded again, we get these sort of spurts up, but again, sort of stabilizing maybe on average around 1,250 gallons per minute, or about a 35% increase in pumping. And, dewatering over a larger area, we expect an expanded zone of impact to the shallow aquifer. And that's not what Itasca presents in their results. So again, this is a map of the, you can see the mineral rights boundary. The orange line here is the 5-foot contour, and that's what they're showing here, changes in the 5-foot contour. The orange line is at the end of 25 years. The purple line is at the end of 65 years. So that area of impact has just expanded only slightly, in some areas not at all. Over here expanded slightly, but not as much as I would have expected for that amount of increase in pumping and that spreading out of the mine, and therefore mine dewatering over a much bigger region. So I have a number of concerns with the model predictions. And the first of that is, boy, even a really well-calibrated model has a large uncertainty to it in its predictions. And by large, I mean it could be off plus or minus by a factor of 2. But it turns out this model's not well calibrated. So the uncertainties are almost certainly larger. And it's not well calibrated because, boy, you're trying to make predictions about what will happen in the shallow aquifer, but there's a lack of historic shallow well water levels to calibrate to. And there are a couple of shortcomings that I think are problems with the report itself. They don't report the effects of historic dewatering. So they don't present contour maps or hydrographs of what's going on, particularly in the later periods of mine dewatering in the 40s and 50s. And, again, I get back to, I want to see those contours. I want to see a 20-foot drop in the Union Hill mine area and greater drops elsewhere. So I think it's really important that Itasca present what their results are at the end of the historic mining. And they also need to provide a water budget. So water budgets are really useful in understanding what's going on in a groundwater system. So how much water is coming from where is water going to, and how much, really lets you understand some of the processes involved. And so I think they also need to be forthcoming about what the water budget is and how that changes over time. And I continue to have concerns about what I think is the incorrect starting point for their future predictions. They started in 1956 with 1956 water levels. I think they need to go back and start running their predictions from current water levels. It's easily done. And the last thing I want to comment on is the recharge rate that was assumed for their modeling. So the other consultant, EMCO, in its report, provided a range from 10 to about 12 inches per year for groundwater recharge. Itasca chose to use the higher end of that range, and the more recharge you have, the less impact. And in fact, Itasca ran a simulation. They increased the recharge by 50% to 18 inches a year, where they got lots less recharge taking place. I think they need to run the opposite scenario, even 10 inches per year, even drop that down below the range, down to 8 inches per year, and see what the size of the impact is when you run it at a reduced recharge rate. And I think that's particularly important in light of climate change. We have warmer and progressively warmer temperatures. I think you're familiar with that in your area with wildfires and with drought going on. And so almost certainly groundwater recharge is going to be reduced in the future. So ways of addressing uncertainties about how much water level decline is going to take place. One of those is RISE is required as part of its permit to monitor shallow groundwater levels, and there's a proposed monitoring plan. And this monitoring plan involves establishing 15 different locations, and those are shown by these red dots on this map. And at each location, they'll install a shallow water level monitoring well and a deep monitoring well. So shallow being about 100 feet, deep about 300 feet. They'd have a water level recording device that would record frequently and data would be reported on a sort of quarterly or every 3-month basis. And so this would get them know early on how much dewatering was actually taking place. And there's a criteria that's used in both the reports that I've been discussing about what defines impact. And that criterion is a 10% reduction of the water column. And I think that's probably a really useful criteria to use in the future to sort of trigger some actions. And the last thing I want to talk about is maybe additional ways to talk about uncertainties. So, anything that can be done to find historic water levels, particularly from, say, the late 1940s, early 1950s. Are there old wells from the area that would have well logs, or any recorded data, histories of other water levels in mine, stories about, say, springs suddenly reappearing in the 1960s when mine dewatering had ceased. So those might help us gain a better understanding of what actually went on during that historic period. Another thing is, in addition to looking at water levels in those 15 monitoring locations that RISE is proposing, is I think it's also important to monitor water levels in private wells. So if I lived up on that ridge over the mine, and I'm a data nerd, so I want to do this anyway, I would get a well sounder and I'd measure the water levels in my wells and in my neighbors' wells. But the sort of official way that this is done is not by, me, the well owner, but to have a consultant come in to monitor those wells and then put the water level data in a report that's ultimately signed by a licensed professional. So I think that would let everybody know what's going on for their particular wells and their neighbors' wells. I think another way of reducing uncertainty is obtain more detailed information on the computer model, particularly what was happening with shallow groundwater levels from the start of their simulation period all the way through that simulated prediction about what future mining impacts are going to be. And also to present a water budget for the mine vicinity. And the last thing I just want to suggest is, if the mine project is approved, set really clear criteria for, that would trigger, say, an expanded monitoring network. When do we need to sort of push out beyond those original 15 monitoring wells? And what are the criteria for when we need to start installing supplemental pipelines and additional hookups before it really becomes a crisis for people? So, I recommend, if you're interested in this, that you can get these reports from the county's website for the mine application. You can read some more. And I think we're going to open it up to some questions now.
Great, thank you so much, June. That was quite a good presentation. Can you go ahead and stop sharing your screen so that we can see everybody? Great. Wow. Okay. That was a lot. So we are going to start some question and answer. I think I'm going to give a moment for everyone to kind of formulate their thoughts. Please go ahead and if you have not already, put your question into the Q&A. Without further ado, let's launch into some questions and answers. I know that Paul answered a lot of questions while the talk was going. If you want to re-ask the question, again, please feel free to repost. And I'm going to read some of the questions that we've gotten so far. The first question comes from Rick. And he says, my understanding is that the groundwater model used by the consultants was based on an aquifer flow and not a fracture flow. Yet the mine is in hard rock. Do you have any comments on the importance of using a fracture flow model?
Very often fractured rock is simulated as a porous medium or an equivalent groundwater system. So, you know, I think it's okay. It's done very, very frequently. And largely it's done that way because there's not enough knowledge about those individual fractures.
Thanks. So while you were talking, you mentioned about, I think, if I were a well owner, I live in downtown, so I'm on municipal, but if I was a well owner and I lived in the area, I mean, the numbers you gave were complex. And I kind of the question I was sort of asking myself, okay, well, how will I be affected? And so one of the things you said was that wells typically are between 100 and 200 feet. And then when you gave the cross section of the geology, you know, you had this kind of top level and then, you know, further deeper levels that were less permeable. Where approximately do wells sit? Are they in the permeable area or deeper?
Yeah, you know, they're most, you know, according to MCO, that really highly weathered zone goes down 100, 120 feet. You know, but then there's certainly a transition. It's a gradual transition to less permeable, less weathered rock. And you know, exactly, but the majority of wells being completed, you know, down to about 200 feet tells me that that's probably where most of the water is, because the drillers aren't going to keep drilling unless there's some advantage to it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. We had another question from Robert Hubbard. He said, he was wondering, he says, does a 10% reduction in water column, what does that translate to in terms of feet measured? Is there any way to?
Well, you know, you'd really have to look at individual wells, and I'd recommend there's a table, I think it's 4-1 in the MCO report. Those of you who have wells can actually go to it in the vicinity of East Bennett Road. And they list the wells there, they list the water column. And so, you know, a 200-foot well is going to have generally a larger water column. It really depends how far down. You could have a 200-foot well, but it's 150 feet down to water. You'd only have 50 feet at the bottom. You could have a 100-foot well and it's 10 feet down to water. That would give you a 90-foot column. So it really depends sort of where you are, probably on the ridge. And it's you know, each well can be different. So, you know, a drawdown of 10 feet, you know, the water level dropping 10 feet might be really critical if you only had a 50-foot water column in your well. That's 20% of your well. But if you had, you know, if you had 150 feet, not quite as critical.
You showed a series of maps that showed the kind of, what you called it, the histography of the water levels for the last 100 years. And that was, I think, really complicated. And there was a question that asked, the very first graph you showed a drop of over 1,000 feet. Okay. And then, so how do you reconcile the expected 10-foot drop to that 1,000 foot that you indicated?
Well, you have to realize that drop is deep down inside the mine. And, you know, they have to dewater all the way to the bottom of the mine. Otherwise, miners can't work safely down there. It's going to lower the water table. It's not going to lower it 1,000 feet, but it's going to drain water down out of that. But the question is, and that's the big uncertainty, and I think what they've simulated is how much, particularly during that historic period, did it drop? Because they haven't been forthcoming other than that one data point of 20 feet of drop in a pretty isolated area at the Union Hill mine.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the consultants used a historic water level, like around the 1950 level, as opposed to current. Why would they? Why do you think they would do that? Such a thing? Is it because they didn't have data, or is it because, I mean, is it misrepresenting the?
I don't know. They have an explanation in their report why they did it. I personally didn't find it convincing. I don't see. They have current day water levels. Why not start from that point in making predictions about the future?
Mm-hmm. There's another question that Ray asks. He says, will the drop in water levels dry out the surface enough to impact vegetation? And if so, would this increase the fire danger in the area at all?
I don't think, let me qualify that. In general, it's not going to lower it that significantly, because most of the time where they've measured water, it's many tens of feet down to the water table. And so that's deeper than most routes go. Where the water table would become much more shallow would be down towards the stream, so in the topographic lows. And there it might affect vegetation in those lower topographic areas, so lower in the valleys.
You also mentioned in your presentation about these monitoring wells that would need to be put in place. When would those 15 monitoring wells by Rise Gold that they propose to be put in place? Is the data gathering done by an independent service, Nevada County, or would Rise Gold be the authority to do that?
So they answer your first question, they're proposing to put the monitoring wells in and collect 6 months of data prior to the start of dewatering. I really think that's too short. I think 2 or 3 years, particularly to look at sort of seasonal variations and year to year, wet year to dry year variations would be important to get that kind of background information. So, I would hope that they would do it, put them in earlier, monitor longer. And what was the second part of, who would be doing this? You'd want to get an independent consultant to do it. It shouldn't be the county. And presumably it's their monitoring program. Rise Gold would hire an independent consultant, and the work would be supervised by a licensed professional.
Okay. So, the CEA has been looking at this and trying to figure out, which landowners who have wells might be impacted. And we've kind of estimated it's probably about 300 wells that are within the mineral rights footprint. Could the impacts of dewatering and ongoing maintenance pumping impact a larger area? And how would you frame that possibility?
It could. I won't say it would, because I haven't done that analysis myself. I think some of the uncertainties in the modeling, if they were to do some of the things I suggested, start at present day, go into the future, clarify what the water levels were like in 1956, would give us maybe a better approach to knowing that answer. So there's no easy answer to, that I can give to how large an area will be impacted or monitored. But I think you could get an improved answer over what's been provided.
one of the takeaways that I got listening to your presentation was that your confidence, there's low confidence in that this model would actually predict well the levels of water, if the mine was dewatered. What could be done to give you more confidence in the modeling?
Well, it would be wonderful if somebody could dig up some historic data. I know you've got a great Nevada County Historic Society up there. Maybe there's something in their archives. If there's anybody who has an old wells. So anything we could get to establish what was really going on with water levels at that time. Mm-hmm. Because that's the most sort of crucial thing to try and improve these predictions. And then just conducting the model properly. And also, one of the things that's very typically done with running models is you do what's called a sensitivity analysis. You take model variables like the permeability, the recharge rate, you raise them up, you lower them down, you try to see sort of the range of impact that you get out of it. And particularly you might do a sort of conservative, not a worst case, but a reasonable worst case. If this were what was going on, if recharge were less, if permeabilities were less, if the amount of water stored were less, what would we be seeing? And that might give you at least a better answer of what a sort of worst case might be.
One thing I want to mention to people, if you do have a well, CEA is really interested, like perhaps residents have some old data about well levels, et cetera, which might be useful. If you are a well owner and you live in the area, let me give you an email that you could talk to CEA, and they would be very interested in hearing from you. It's, hang on, let me turn on my phone here. It's wells@cea-nc.org. And you can contact CEA that way, and particularly interested in well owners who are concerned or who have some information that might be really useful to help us think about this. There's a question from Ron. It says, my understanding is that under Cedar Ridge, which is the ridge adjoining the mine property, is a lava cap that expels water slowly to the surface that supplies Woodpecker Ravine Creek that flows into South Wolf Creek. Would the dewatering of the mine cause this surface flow to drain into the mine to be pumped into Wolf Creek, thereby drying up the Woodpecker Ravine Creek? Is that a possibility?
I don't know enough about the area to answer that. The model predicts a reduction in stream flow in South Wolf Creek by about 10%, and a smaller percentage reduction in the main branch of Wolf Creek. And I don't really know enough about the area to answer that. Certainly lowering the water table reduces the flow to the creeks. And if the water level gets low enough, it can reverse that flow. So instead of groundwater flowing to the creeks, surface water flows out of the creeks into the ground, seeps into the ground, if the water levels in the ground get low enough.
There's another question by Ria. He says, Dr. Oberdorfer, given your years of teaching graduate level groundwater modeling classes and being a thesis advisor for numerous graduate students, if one of your students submitted the model discussed tonight to fulfill a thesis under your supervision, would you accept it?
There's a loaded question.
Yeah, really.
As it stands, no, it would be, as a thesis, absolutely unacceptable, because in a thesis you need to detail really every step you have to do, you've done, and justify every step. And this is not a thesis, but Itasca needs to be much more forthcoming about exactly what they've done and what their results are saying. And, you know, the few things I pointed out, you know, do you see more than 20-foot historic you saw at the Union Mine? Do you see greater than that elsewhere? If you don't see that, then there's something wrong with your model. So, you know, it's, no, but you work with students and they make revisions and they come up with the right answer ultimately.
There's a question from Pamela. She said, since fractured rock aquifers are not included under Sigma, what legal recourse will the individual or community have if there are water quality or quantity issues?
You know, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm not an expert on water rights. And so I'm hoping that concerned people maybe group together and contact a water rights attorney, because, you know, I don't know to what extent there's an idea of prior appropriation. So the first person to use the water has greater rights than people who come later. And so I don't know if Rice Gold can claim, oh, well, because we bought the mineral rights and it goes back and they were using this in the, you know, early 1900s. But there's also something that says you have to continuously use those water rights or you lose them. Yeah. And so I think, you know, you really have to ask an attorney about that. Yeah. And then I think of the people, you know, who have wells in that overlying aquifer who have been pumping water for 50 years. 50 years is a pretty good history. You would think that they would have some water rights also, but I'm not the person to answer that, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Dr.